Imagine the scene. 1991. Broken Bow, Oklahoma. A place where the air smells of pine needles and red clay, where everyone knows your business. And church isn't just a Sunday affair, it's the entire affair. Sarah was 19, full of fire and ambition, fresh out of school and saving up for university in Tulsa. She wasn't just some girl. She was her mother's whole world, her little brother's hero, a waitress at the only decent diner in town, always laughing. But on a sultry, moonless July night, Sarah vanished without a trace after her late shift, leaving behind nothing but her untouched Toyota, parked outside her small, rented flat on the edge of the Ouachita National Forest. No forced entry, no note, just a chilling, sudden void. The local police reckoned she'd done a runner, perhaps chasing a boy or a dream. But her mother, Jennifer, knew in her gut that something was dreadfully wrong. The years crawled by, the case went stone cold, and the grief hardened into a collective scar on the community. Everyone whispered. Everyone had a theory. Nobody knew the truth was hiding in plain sight, living among them, preaching from the very pulpit. Decades later, a discovery no one saw coming, a cold case review, a sliver of forgotten evidence. A scientific breakthrough would blow this case wide open and reveal secrets darker than anyone could have imagined, exposing the beloved shepherd as the wolf. This one, folks, is utterly chilling. Before we plunge into the depths of this mystery, you know the score. If you're a true crime aficionado and you live for these cold case resolutions, do hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this. I'm telling you, the deception in this story is on another level entirely. It will make your jaw drop. You will want to stick around for the conclusion. Let me know below if you had heard of this case before it hit the headlines last year. I've done my research. I have the documents. And while some details have been dramatized and names changed to protect privacy, this story is based on real events that shook a community to its very foundations. Let's get into it. Act 1. The Vanishing. Sarah, genuinely, was the kind of girl who was always on the move, always planning her next step. She wasn't cut out for a small town like Broken Bow forever, but she didn't resent it, either. That summer of 1991, she was grafting, pulling double shifts at the Pine Needle Diner, pouring coffee and saving every last penny. Her ambition was to get to the city, perhaps to study criminology. The irony is not lost on me. She dreamt of being one of those sharp, savvy investigators you see on the telly, the ones who crack cases no one else can touch. She possessed a fierce loyalty, a radiant laugh, and a sense of justice that was seriously impressive for a 19-year-old. Her mother, Jennifer, was a single parent who'd worked herself to the bone to give Sarah and her younger brother, Daniel, a decent life. She saw that fire in Sarah and was her staunchest supporter. They weren't wealthy, but they had love, and in McCurtain County, sometimes that was all you had. The last day anyone saw Sarah alive, or at least, the last day she was confirmed to be alive, was a Tuesday, a sweltering, humid, typical Oklahoma summer day, where the air hung so thick you could almost chew it. Sarah clocked off from the diner at around 11:30 at night. She had mentioned to her colleague, Amanda, that she had an odd feeling. Nothing specific, just this persistent sense that someone was watching her. "It's probably nothing," she told Amanda. "Just my imagination playing tricks on me." But even as she said it, her gut, the one thing she'd been taught to always trust, was screaming that something was amiss. She drove her battered Toyota Corolla the 2 miles home. Her block of flats was small, just 4 units, tucked away near the woods. It was quiet, perhaps too quiet. She phoned Jennifer from the landline the moment she got in, around midnight, as was her routine. Jennifer recalls the call was brief. Sarah sounded tired, said she was going straight to bed to be ready for her morning shift. "Love you, Mum," she said. "Love you too, darling." "Sleep tight," Jennifer replied. That was the end of their conversation. But it was only the beginning of the nightmare. The following morning, Wednesday, the call came not from Sarah, but from Amanda at the diner. "Is Sarah ill?" "She hasn't turned up for her 7 a.m. shift," Amanda asked Jennifer. Jennifer's blood ran cold. Sarah never missed work, ever. Not even for a tornado. She drove straight to Sarah's flat, a knot tightening in her stomach with every mile. The Corolla was there. The lights were out. The door was locked. She had a spare key. She walked in and knew at once this wasn't a girl who had simply run away. Her handbag was on the kitchen counter. Her keys were beside it. Her uniform was still crumpled in the laundry basket. Her university application forms were spread out on the dining table, and her bed was neatly made. The only thing missing was Sarah herself. She had utterly vanished into thin air. Jennifer called the police immediately. The initial response, frankly, was infuriating. Small-town coppers, perhaps overworked, perhaps jaded, or maybe just clinging to the oldest trope in the book. She's 19, she'll turn up. They treated it as a runaway case, a young woman needing a break. They took a half-hearted report, promised to look into it, and left Jennifer sitting alone in a silent flat, clutching a telephone receiver that would never again carry her daughter's voice. The feeling of helplessness was crushing, a physical weight on her chest. Jennifer didn't wait. She put up flyers herself, driving to every petrol station, every launderette, every diner from Broken Bow to Idabel. She phoned the local newspaper. She phoned the television station in Fort Smith. She gathered Daniel and a handful of friends and began scouring the woods near the block of flats. They walked until their feet bled, calling Sarah's name until their throats were raw. This is where the community, initially, rallied. And this is where we first encounter the man who would become central to this entire tragic saga. Reverend Robert of the Broken Bow First Baptist Church. Reverend Robert was a pillar of that town. In his mid-60s, with salt and pepper hair, and eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow and comfort in the world, he had baptized generations, counseled families through divorces, and presided over countless funerals. When Jennifer arrived at the church, hysterical and begging for help, Reverend Robert was there, as steady as a rock. He immediately organized search parties, using the church as a command post. He cooked meals for the volunteers. He stood on the church steps, looking out at the anxious crowd, and prayed publicly for Sarah's safe return. "The Lord is our shepherd," he told the crowd, his voice gentle but firm. "We must keep the faith. We will bring Sarah home." In truth, nobody in that crowd could have ever guessed the man leading the prayer vigil was the monster who knew precisely where Sarah was. He was acting like a veritable saint, a community leader, all while harboring the darkest secret in McCurtain County history. That level of deception is truly insidious. The search efforts in Act 1 are crucial because they reveal the sheer scale of the cover-up. Hundreds of people, volunteers, state troopers, even some people from Texas combed the area. They searched the nearby lakes, the logging roads, the old abandoned barns. Reverend Robert himself was often seen out there, hands deep in his pockets, shaking his head with a look of profound sorrow. He would hug Jennifer, telling her, "We will not give up, sister. God will provide the answer." The investigators, the few dedicated ones who were truly on the case, settled on a few early theories. Runaway. This was the easy option, the one that saved them from doing any real work. Jennifer shut that down in no uncertain terms. Sarah wouldn't leave Daniel, wouldn't leave her money, wouldn't leave her plans. Abduction by a stranger. This was the most terrifying prospect. A predator passing through the area who saw an opportunity and seized it. This theory had the whole town locking their doors earlier, watching their children more closely. The fear was palpable. Foul play by someone she knew. This was the hardest to accept. Who in their close-knit community would harm Sarah? They interviewed everyone she worked with, everyone she went to school with, and every single person came up clean, or at least without sufficient motive or evidence to hold them. As the days turned into weeks, the posters faded in the Oklahoma Sunday. The search parties dwindled. The media's immediate, intense focus faded, replaced by the next sensational headline. Sarah Lawrence became a missing person statistic, a milk carton photo, a heartbreaking local legend. Jennifer, though, never gave up. She kept Sarah's room exactly as it was. She kept the porch light on every single night. The constant, gnawing, brutal uncertainty, not knowing if her daughter was cold or hungry or frightened or even alive, was a unique kind of hell. The police, they got complacent, no doubt about it. Jennifer would later tell a reporter, years down the line, they said there was no evidence. But when you're talking about a human life, no evidence simply means you haven't looked hard enough yet. She was right. The initial investigation missed things, small details that seemed insignificant at the time but would become glaring red flags 3 decades later. The fact that Reverend Robert was so often too helpful, the subtle shift in the man's demeanor after the memorial service, the one he officiated for a girl whose body he knew was already decomposing in the dark earth. The first memorial service was held 6 months after Sarah vanished. Jennifer needed closure, something, anything, to stop the constant, agonizing search. It was a beautiful, devastating service. Reverend Robert's eulogy was a masterpiece of pastoral solace. He spoke about Sarah's light, her promise, and the hope of heaven. He talked about justice on earth and redemption in the next life. He cried, genuinely. His performance was so convincing, so heartbreakingly authentic, that it solidified his image as the community's moral anchor. The truth? He had driven out to the Ouachita National Forest on that moonless night, the very night Sarah disappeared, and buried her body deep within a secluded part of a hunting lease to which he had access. He had returned to his weathered farmhouse on County Road 47 and had washed the dirt from his hands, ready to preach about salvation come Sunday. The sheer audacity of this man, the depth of his hypocrisy, is what makes this case so utterly astounding. By the time the calendar turned to 1992, Sarah's case had officially gone cold. The file was boxed up, labeled Missing Person, Presumed Deceased, and tucked away in a dusty corner of the McCurtain County Sheriff's Office. The town tried to move on, but a certain darkness settled over Broken Bow. It was the knowledge that a predator was in their midst, and they were powerless to stop him. Before we delve into the long, frustrating years of this mystery, leave a 1 in the comments. If you love this genre, stories about persistence and justice, no matter how long it takes, it took 3 decades for Sarah's truth to surface. And Act 2 is where the real struggle begins. Act 2, the long silence. For Jennifer, the next 3 decades were a blur of birthdays without a cake, Christmases without the loudest laugh, and a telephone that never rang with the voice she so desperately longed to hear. The pain never turned into a dull ache. It stayed sharp, a constant, debilitating presence. She became the woman who lived for her missing daughter. She attended every true crime conference she could afford. She taught herself about forensic science, cold case protocol, and victim advocacy. She was a mother-turned self-taught detective, fueled by pure, unadulterated maternal love and rage. Daniel grew up under the shadow of his sister's disappearance. He was just a boy when Sarah vanished, and he became a quiet, serious young man, always looking over his shoulder, always aware of the darkness in the world. He became Jennifer's right-hand man, helping her maintain the private investigation website she set up for Sarah, checking leads that came in from all over the country, most of them bogus, a few of them terrifying, all of them leading to dead ends. Reverend Robert continued his life, seemingly untouched by the tragedy he had orchestrated. He preached, he counseled, he lived a respectable, seemingly blameless life. He watched Daniel grow up. He comforted Jennifer during her darkest moments of grief, even praying with her for the soul of the very monster who had taken her daughter. It was a level of sociopathic detachment that is, quite frankly, chilling to the bone. The case was re-examined several times over the years, usually when a new investigator took charge of the cold case squad, or when a national television program ran a feature on the area. The technology changed, but the file remained the same. In the early 2000s, DNA technology was becoming standard. Every piece of evidence, the few stray fibers found in Sarah's car, the soil samples from the initial search area, was reanalyzed. Nothing. The perpetrator had been meticulous, precise, and cautious. He was, after all, a man who lived a life of routine, control, and deep-seated duplicity. He knew the woods, he knew the community, and he knew how to cover his tracks. One of the near misses came in 2005. A hunter, walking an unregistered plot of the Ouachita National Forest a good 30 miles from town, reported the discovery of a tattered piece of blue fabric tangled in the roots of a giant oak tree. Jennifer, clinging to a thread of hope, immediately recognized the shade of blue. It was Sarah's favorite color, the color of a t-shirt she often wore to work. The police collected the fabric, but it was too degraded by years of exposure to the elements to yield any viable DNA or forensic evidence. The hunter's patch of land was far from any known access road, and the police, frustrated and stretched for resources, never fully extended their search grid that far out. They logged the fabric and filed it away. Another devastating false lead, another wave of despair washing over the Lawrence family. That was the point I was truly serious about giving up, Jennifer admitted. But then I would look at Daniel and at Sarah's empty chair, and I knew I simply could not. The monster would win the moment I stopped searching. The community itself changed. Broken Bow grew a little larger, a little more modern, but the shadow of Sarah's disappearance still loomed large. People started leaving their hometown, not just for jobs, but to escape the constant reminder of unsolved malevolence. The weather, the very landscape, it all seemed to reflect the mood. The summers were too hot, the winters too cold, the silence of the woods no longer comforting, but threatening. The small, isolated farmhouse, where the Reverend Robert lived, became just another old building on a country road. He eventually retired from the church, a revered and celebrated figure, moving into quiet obscurity, still preparing his sermons every Saturday, still receiving visitors who sought his gentle counsel. He lived a life of respect and peace, a life brazenly stolen from the girl he had murdered. In 2018, everything began to shift. A new generation of investigators joined the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, young, tenacious, and well-versed in new technology. One investigator, Eric, a man from New York City, who had that sharp, streetwise edge, took over the cold case files. He did not know the people, he did not know the history, and he gave no credence to the old theories. He treated the file as if the crime had occurred only yesterday. Eric was poring over the original, handwritten case notes when he noticed something that didn't sit right. Early interviews mentioned the Reverend Robert being unusually helpful and coordinating the entire effort. Eric thought, why would a busy pastor take it upon himself to run the search? Why was he not delegating? It was a small detail, but it didn't add up. Most community leaders offer support. This man appeared to have assumed command. Eric retrieved the old DNA profiles from the evidence room, including the soil samples and the scant trace evidence from the car. He was not looking for a perfect match. He was looking for a profile to run against all available databases, especially new genealogy websites and CODIS databases. It was a long shot, to be sure. The breakthrough clue did not come from a dramatic find, but from a mundane technological advance, an application of forensic genealogy coupled with soil science. The OSBI lab, working with a university, reanalyzed the soil samples taken from the interior of Sarah's car on the floor. The samples were taken the day after she disappeared. The scientists were able to narrow the soil type to a very specific, limited geological region, a region that happened to include the northern part of the Wasita National Forest. More importantly, a faint, degraded partial male DNA profile was finally extracted from a tiny smear on the back of the driver's seat, a smear initially dismissed as mere contamination. The profile was incomplete, but it was enough to be compared to the vast new databases. Let me know in the comments which case you would like to hear about next, because you are not prepared for this revelation. The DNA led to a distant relation, a cousin in another state, who had uploaded their own profile to a public genealogy database. This family tree, painstakingly constructed by OSBI analysts, eventually led them back to the source, the direct line. It led them back to an elderly, well-respected former clergyman by the name of Robert, the man who was praying for Sarah's return while the very soil from his crime was sitting in an evidence locker for 30 years. Frankly, the level of cold-blooded calculation is chilling. The investigators placed the Reverend Robert under observation. The surveillance was subtle, discreet. They monitored his movements, his habits. They required a direct, uncontaminated DNA sample to confirm the hit. They got it, quite by chance, one afternoon in 2021 when he stopped at a local petrol station. He bought a fizzy drink, threw the empty can in a bin, and a technician was on hand moments later to retrieve it. The lab results came back a week later. It was a direct and undeniable match. The partial DNA profile from Sarah's car, the faint smear, belonged to the Reverend Robert. 30 years of deception, 30 years of a respected life, all came crashing down because of a DNA match from a drinks can. It was utterly staggering. The air carried the scent of pine and red clay through the remote hills of McCartan County, Oklahoma. It was September 2021. A single, unmarked SUV rolled to a stop outside the weathered farmhouse on County Road 47, 30 miles from the nearest town. Inside, the now 68-year-old Robert was preparing his Sunday sermon at the kitchen table, the same ritual he had performed every Saturday evening for the past 27 years since retiring. The knock came at 7 minutes to 7 in the evening. It was deliberate, formal. Reverend Robert, OSBI. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1991 disappearance and murder of Sarah. The officers later said the elderly man's hands reportedly never ceased their movement across his notes for a long moment, as if completing one final thought before setting down his pen. His voice was steady when he finally spoke, the same voice that had offered comfort to so many. "I was wondering when you would find her." He confessed to everything soon after, leading investigators to the body, 30 years on, still hidden in the Wasita National Forest. Justice was finally, brutally, delivered. Act 2. The long deception. The deceit was not simply in the act, but in the sustained performance. For 3 decades, Robert played the part of the righteous man with chilling perfection. It is a kind of double life that is, in truth, almost impossible to comprehend. He did not merely attend the vigils, he led them. He did not just offer comfort, he offered communion. Imagine sitting in a pew, receiving the host from the very hand of your daughter's murderer. That was Jennifer's reality for 30 years. Jennifer, though, never entirely trusted him, not on a conscious level. Every few years, she would cross paths with him at the local supermarket or at a community event. He would always give her the same gentle, sorrowful expression. "Still praying for a breakthrough, Jennifer," he would say, placing a kind, pastoral hand on her arm. She remembers those touches now, 30 years later, and a visceral wave of nausea washes over her. She never suspected him, but a part of her very soul, her intuitive, mother's soul, had always been wary of this man, whose sorrow seemed just a little too perfect, a little too refined. The feeling was, on some level, always there, a flicker of suspicion, immediately extinguished by the sheer absurdity of the notion. A reverend? The reverend? The investigators in the 1990s focused heavily on a few local drifters and Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Tyler. Tyler was innocent, had a solid alibi, and was devastated by Sarah's disappearance, but he fit the profile of the jilted lover. They spent months digging into his life, harassing him, making his life a living hell. Robert, all the while, was sitting in the very same room as Tyler during a police interview, offering him water and advising him to trust in God's plan. The sheer audacity is frankly staggering. The details of Robert's life during the 2 decades following the initial search are a study in normality masking monstrosity. He never moved. He never changed his routine. He never showed any signs of stress or guilt, at least, not that anyone could perceive. He had a family, a wife, Elizabeth, and 2 adult children who believed him to be the most moral man they had ever known. His sermons were about forgiveness, about seeking truth, about the peril of secrets. He preached against the very sin he himself had committed, week after week, year after year. It is a kind of psychological warfare that is truly on another level of duplicity. The re-examination of the case by the OSBI team in 2018 was a masterclass in modern cold case investigation. Eric, the new investigator, approached it like a mathematical problem, not a tragic story. He pulled up the original aerial photographs from the summer of 1991. He cross-referenced the soil samples with the geological survey maps of McCurtain County. He was not looking for a body. He was looking for an anomaly. He found one, a small 5-foot square section of the Wasita National Forest, which was part of a private hunting lease, showed a very slight disturbance in the ground cover in a 1991 photograph, a disturbance that had been completely overgrown by a 1992 photograph. The initial search parties had meticulously covered the public parts of the forest. They had been wary of trespassing on private land, especially one owned by a very private, wealthy landowner who lived out of state. Eric delved into the lease records. Who had access? Who had a key to the gate? The list was short. It included the landowner, his foreman, and a few close friends. The foreman had since died. The friends were elderly. And then there was Robert. Robert, it transpired, had done the landowner a significant favor years ago, counseling him through a family crisis. As a token of gratitude, the landowner had given Robert a perpetual, unwritten permission to hunt and fish on the property, complete with a key to the gate. Robert was one of perhaps 4 people in the county with routine access to that secluded land, a land he had helped search for Sarah, a land he had convinced investigators was too far off the beaten track for her to have reached. Truly, the layers of deceit are suffocating. This new lead, the private lease, Robert's access, and the subtle 1991 ground disturbance was circumstantial, yet powerful. Combined with the slow-moving DNA analysis, it put Robert squarely in the crosshairs. But they could not just arrest a revered former minister on a decades-old, grainy photograph and a guess. They needed that DNA confirmation. The months leading up to the arrest were agonizing for the OSBI team. They had their man, but they had to be patient. They watched him greet his grandchildren, mow his lawn, and visit the sick. Eric felt a constant, grinding pressure to handle this correctly, not just for the case, but for Jennifer. In a completely separate universe of grief and advocacy, Jennifer was raising money to hire a private cold case consultant in 2020. She wanted a fresh pair of eyes. She was still fighting, giving interviews, keeping Sarah's name alive in the local consciousness. She was on a local radio program in the spring of 2021, and the moderator asked her what she would say to the person who had taken Sarah. Her voice was steady, hardened by years of pain. "I would tell them that I forgive them, but that does not mean they do not deserve to face the justice of man. I want the truth. That is all. I just want to bring my baby home." Robert, driving home from a Bible study, heard that very interview on his lorry's radio. The officers would later theorize that this precise moment, hearing Jennifer offer forgiveness, whilst still demanding justice, may have been the first crack in his flawless facade. The performance, which had spanned decades, was drawing to its inevitable close. He was growing old, his health was beginning to fail, and the steadfast certainty of his secret was starting to unravel. He was, in his own quiet way, weary of the entire charade. The moment the DNA match was confirmed, the OSBI moved with surgical precision. They didn't storm his house. Instead, they executed a quiet warrant with a calm, measured approach. They had no desire for a spectacle. What they sought was a confession and a location. When Robert finally uttered the words, "I wondered if you'd ever find her," the silence in that farmhouse kitchen was absolutely deafening. It was no longer a question of his guilt. It was a complete surrender. He had been waiting, perhaps even praying, for his own kind of agonizing resolution. The peace he so often preached about was not his to possess until the secret was finally brought into the light. His confession was meticulous, chillingly so, and brief. He admitted to approaching Sarah that night near her flat, using his pastoral authority to lure her into a conversation before overpowering her. The motive, the precise details of their interaction, those were kept sealed to protect Jennifer, and quite rightly so. All that truly matters is the result: a young life extinguished, a secret buried deep, and a community's trust utterly shattered. The next morning, he drove the OSBI team out to the Wasita National Forest. It was a day of stark, crisp clarity in September. The location was remote, the earth still soft from a recent downpour. He pointed to a spot beneath a vast, ancient pine. The area was a small patch of high ground, a perfect site for a burial that would remain undisturbed by flooding. The old gate to the hunting lease, for which Robert had kept the key all those years, opened onto the secluded road. The excavation was conducted with a quiet reverence. When the forensic anthropologists finally uncovered Sarah's remains, remarkably preserved by the clay-rich soil, 30 years of searching culminated in one heartbreaking moment. Jennifer, although she had been warned, chose to wait at the command post nearby. When Eric walked over to her, his face grim, he had no need to say a word. Jennifer simply nodded, tears finally falling not of sorrow, but of a strange mixture of profound grief and absolute, crushing relief. Her baby was no longer a mystery. She was, at last, home. This kind of resolution, ladies and gentlemen, after 3 long decades, is what we call justice. But justice, it must be said, cannot bring back the lost years. That is the undeniable truth. Before we proceed to Act 3, where we will cover the trial, the aftermath, and the final closure, do let us know in the comments which country you're watching from right now. I'd be fascinated to know where our true crime community is tuning in from. Act 3. The break and the resolution. The arrest of the Reverend Robert was a thunderbolt that didn't just shock Broken Bow, it all but split the town in two. You have to understand, this wasn't some stranger snatched from a motorway. This was the man who had married their children, buried their parents, and held their hands through every hardship for 40 years. When the news finally broke, a former, beloved reverend arrested for a 3-decade-old murder, the entire community went absolutely spare. People were ringing the police station demanding answers. Some were in tears, some were furious. Others were simply catatonic with disbelief. The actual arrest? In all seriousness, it was almost anticlimactic. When Eric and the OSBI agents walked into that quiet farmhouse kitchen, Robert made no attempt to deny it. He was finished. The facade had been meticulously maintained for 30 years. And in that moment, When the DNA finally caught up with him, the man simply seemed relieved to lay down his burden. He was, in his own quiet way, exhausted by the secret. "I wondered if you'd ever find her," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when reading from scripture. They brought him into the interview room, no handcuffs, just a quiet conversation. He sat there, this man in his late 60s, looking for all the world like anyone's kindly grandfather. And he began to talk. No solicitor, no coercion, just a steady, chilling admission. The initial police report from 1991 had mentioned an anonymous tip dismissed at the time about Sarah having had a confrontation with a church elder regarding something untoward he was doing at the church. Robert had used his position to pressure Sarah into a situation she did not want to be in. She had threatened to expose him not for the main crime, but for a separate, private indiscretion he was desperately trying to conceal. He was a man, obsessed with control and his reputation, and Sarah, with her fierce sense of justice, represented a threat he simply could not tolerate. On that July night, he drove to her flat, not far from the church vicarage where he lived at the time. He told her they needed to talk about the situation privately, invoking his role as her spiritual guide. When she realized the conversation was not about repentance, but about silencing her, she fought back. He overpowered her, a strong, desperate man protecting a lifetime of deceit. He strangled her right there, in the flat, and then executed a clean, precise plan. He wiped down everything, placed her handbag and keys on the counter to make it appear as though she had walked out, and put her body in the boot of his car, a dark-colored saloon that was common back then, easily lost in the rural landscape. The burial location was key to the concealment. It was not random. It was a secluded tract of the Wasita National Forest to which he had exclusive access. He knew the land, he knew the weak spots in the search grids, and he knew precisely how long it would take for nature to reclaim the disturbance. He drove out there, dug the grave deep, and covered her with earth and undergrowth. Then came the most deeply unsettling part. He drove back, parked the saloon, and went straight into his church office. He sat down and wrote his Sunday sermon. His alibi was his own reputation. Who would ever question a man of God found praying in his office in the small hours of the morning? Truly, that level of coldness is an evil of a different order entirely. The day after his arrest, Robert agreed to lead the investigators to the location. The scene, 30 years later, was heavy with a profound silence. Eric and the forensic team stood there, in the dense forest, with the elderly man who calmly pointed to the ground beneath the shade of a massive, ancient pine. He had remembered the exact spot, not out of guilt, but because of the sheer, monumental effort of burying his secret so very deep. When Jennifer received the call that they had found Sarah, not just the murderer, but her actual, physical location, she did not fall apart. She did not scream. She simply said, "Thank God, thank God." 30 years of not knowing, of searching every face in every crowd, of the constant, brutal perhaps it was finally over. The recovery of the body was painstaking and agonizingly slow. The forensic team, using ground-penetrating radar and hand tools, worked for 3 days to exhume the remains, ensuring every piece of evidence and every bone was treated with the utmost dignity. Sarah was finally free from the cold earth. The confirmation was swift and undeniable, and yet, ultimately, unnecessary. Robert's DNA was already a match, but seeing the remains, seeing the end of the mystery, was what Jennifer and Daniel needed to begin the impossible journey towards healing. Do let me know in the comments what case you would like to hear about next, because the way this family stood strong through all of this is nothing short of inspiring. The psychological fallout for Robert's family was immense. His wife, Elizabeth, a kind, quiet woman who had stood by him throughout all the years of his ministry, was utterly shattered. She had been married to a ghost, a brilliant actor, a monster wearing a mask of piety. She immediately filed for divorce and, in a public statement released by her solicitor, apologized to Jennifer and the Lawrence family for the role her husband's position played in the crime. She and her children essentially vanished from Broken Bow, unable to face the sheer scale of the betrayal. The prosecution decided upon a plea deal, which, in truth, caused a great deal of controversy. The evidence was ironclad: the confession, the DNA, the location of the body. But Robert was 68, frail, and the cost of a long, drawn-out capital murder trial, followed by years of appeals, would have put the Lawrence family and the community through hell all over again. Robert pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing was the final, devastating chapter of this story. The courtroom was packed, overflowing with members of Robert's former congregation, the sheriff's deputies from 1991, and of course, Jennifer and Daniel. Robert stood before the judge, looking small and insignificant in his prison-issue jumpsuit. The judge spoke with a cold, measured fury about the abuse of trust, the calculated evil, and the devastation wrought by this crime. Then came the victim impact statements. Daniel, now a quiet man in his mid-30s, stood first. His voice was firm. He did not shout. He simply told the court what his life had been like, growing up without his big sister, the constant fear, the loss of innocence. "You didn't just take my sister's life, Mr. Robert," he said, looking the former reverend directly in the eye. "You stole my mother's peace, you stole my childhood, and you stole 30 years of our family's future. I hope that every single day you spend in that cage, you remember the face of the girl you silenced." He spoke his truth, undeniably, and it hit everyone in that room like a physical blow. Jennifer was the last to speak. She walked directly to the podium, ignoring the judge, focusing her entire being on the man who had pretended to be her friend. She spoke of the last time she heard Sarah's voice, the final, "I love you." She described the agony of putting up posters that faded, of tearing them down only to replace them with new, brighter ones. She spoke of Robert's presence at the memorial service. "You hugged me, Robert," Jennifer said, her voice trembling but filled with steel. "You put your hand on my shoulder and told me God was watching out for her. All that time, you knew where my baby was. You are not a man of God. You are a devil, and you hid your soul behind a collar. I brought my daughter home, and now I hand you over to true judgment. And I forgive you, not for you, but for me. I need to be free of you." It was a powerful, beautiful, and utterly gut-wrenching moment. Robert showed no emotion, a final, cold act of detachment. The judge brought the gavel down, pronouncing the sentence, life. Justice was served, but quietly, the scar remains. The years of searching were over. Sarah was laid to rest next to her grandmother in the family plot. 30 years late, but finally returned to the earth, with dignity. The family had closure, but they also had a lifetime of pain to process. Jennifer sold the house that had become an open wound and moved to a small coastal town, seeking a new beginning, a place where the air did not smell of betrayal and old secrets. Daniel became a strong advocate for cold case funding and victims' rights, honoring his sister's memory by fighting for others. The community of Broken Bow had to grapple with a shocking truth, that evil does not always look like a stranger in the night. Sometimes, it wears the face of your most trusted confidant. The church went through a crisis of faith, but ultimately, it emerged stronger, realizing that a building or a title does not define morality, actions do. The true crime world was obsessed with this case for months. It had everything: the small town setting, the decades-long mystery, the shocking identity of the killer, and the ultimate triumph of modern science. It serves as a stark reminder that even the most meticulous concealments will eventually crumble when the right people ask the right questions and new technology finally catches up. In conclusion, so what can we possibly take from a narrative as harrowing as this one? Firstly, always trust your gut instinct. Jennifer knew from the very start that Sarah had not simply run away. She heeded that persistent inner voice, even when officials dismissed her concerns. When something feels profoundly wrong, when a situation is deeply suspect, do not brush it aside as paranoia. Trust that feeling in your core. It could well save your life, or it might just fuel the resolve needed to fight for someone you love for 30 long years. Secondly, be ever vigilant of the wolves in sheep's clothing. This story serves as a brutal lesson in the violation of trust. True friends do not lead you into perilous circumstances, and those in positions of power, be it spiritual, professional, or personal, who insist on secrecy or blind compliance, must be met with immediate suspicion. It is right to question authority. It is your right to say no. Justice cannot bring back the dead, but it carries profound meaning. It means that Robert, the man who constructed a life of comfort and respect upon a foundation of murder, will end his days in a concrete cell, utterly stripped of his reputation and his liberty. It means Sarah Lawrence is no longer a name on a missing persons file, but a woman who was cherished, who was found, and whose story has finally brought the truth to light. Jennifer and Daniel continue to honor Sarah's memory. In her name, they established a scholarship fund for young women in Oklahoma, aspiring to a career in criminal justice, the very dreams Sarah was pursuing when her life was stolen. They choose to celebrate her life, not merely her loss. That, in essence, is the key to survival, transmuting pain into purpose. The ground where Robert's farmhouse stood for decades, preserved for 3 decades as a monument to his deceit, was eventually sold. The new owners, oblivious to the trauma woven into the soil, planted bright, new flowers in the front garden. And in the Wasita National Forest, the place where Sarah's body lay concealed for 30 years, has been entirely reclaimed by nature. The forest remembers, yet the earth has once more sealed its secret. The cold case was officially closed. The file, now complete with a confession and a conviction, was archived. Yet Sarah Lawrence's story endures a stark reminder that some silences demand to be broken, some secrets are destined to be unearthed, and justice, however long delayed, is a pursuit worthy of our efforts until the very end. Please leave a comment below if you believe justice was truly served in this case. I'm keen to know if you feel a life sentence was sufficient for a betrayal of this magnitude. Thank you for joining me for this difficult, but ultimately resolved, case. Next time, we shall be delving into the vanishing of a Silicon Valley tech executive who disappeared without a trace from a locked building on a Friday night, and the single email that blew the entire investigation wide open. Until then, stay safe, remain vigilant, and please do hit that like and subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.